So I think we're there. Um,
Yep.
we can get started. Again, I want to thank everybody for spending part of your day with us today, this afternoon. So good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I believe most of you are somewhere on the North American continent. So again, greatly appreciate you joining us. Today's session, as you know, we're going to talk about future-proofing financial institutions and discussing what we'll call roadmap topics to modernizing legacy systems. We have a fantastic assortment of speakers today covering the full stack of the topics that are all part of this bigger picture of legacy systems and modernization and so on. So if you think about it, um, legacy systems, modernization, transformations, they cover a huge range of different topics, right? So if you think about it, the principal driver behind any of these is we are increasingly under pressure as organizations to open up new markets of opportunity, capture more customers, avoid regulatory impacts, drive down costs while driving up product value and efficiency, and so on. And these are the business drivers behind us. The next level down, however, is supported by a range of different, what I'll call procedural regulatory issues that help us stay between the guardrails of managing a business properly and effectively and transparently. And doing this in a way so that we maintain our adherence to compliance related issues, regulatory issues, and et cetera. The layer below that talks about how do we manage these projects to maintain conversion, to adhere to on-time delivery, to support customers? How do we do this in a way where it's structured and disciplined and we're adhering to best practices and conversions? And then at the very bottom of our stack, it's where the gears mesh. It's where the technology finds its way home. It's where the mechanics get their hands dirty, opening up the hood and really getting into it, right? But all of these elements all play together. There's no simple way to flip a switch and convert to the technologies of tomorrow. In fact, I would say this, our industry is, I think, one of the only industries that I can think of where we spend all of our todays thinking about how we cannibalize the foundational systems of yesterday in order to successfully adopt the technologies of tomorrow and prepare ourselves for future growth. And it's an amazing sort of paradigm that we live in where we invest millions and millions of dollars, but we're never there. We're never satisfied. And we're always growing and looking future. And all of us in this call today, in some way or another, represent large data-dependent organizations. We're all looking for that more effective, more informed operating model, right? We are today, I would say this, for the longest time, in our industry, we talked about the fact that we exist in the app economy. We were still living in the shadow of this thing called the app economy. But I would say that we, for a long time now, no longer been living in the app economy. We are now living in the connected systems economy. And that's exactly at the center of what we'll be talking about today. How to drive more seamlessness, how to gain a more complete understanding of clients, assets, organizational alignment, risk positions, threats, and more. Think about it. Every day we talk about things that should be basic to us, but we still struggle with because of disparities in systems and data. Things like anti-money laundering, know your client, governance, regulatory, and compliance issues, which are numerous and growing and ever present. Cyber issues, cyber threat issues, and so on. All of these issues blend together. We'll touch on all of these in that stack approach that we talked about today. Let me introduce our speakers very briefly. Carrie Forbes, who's the principal of Rockstar Advisory. She's the former CEO of Lead Data. Carrie has been involved in so many issues in the credit union and banking community here in Canada. She's a fantastic resource, and she'll be talking at length about some of these topics. Michael Nolan, who has been involved in so many integration, implementation projects covering a range of these different related topics. Darren Stevens, who again is a modernization strategy. He's a specialist in a systems architect. When I talk about the guys that can open up the hood and get into the gears and get their hands dirty, that's Darren. And again, if you cover all of this, every one of these experts will touch on every one of these issues related to the stack. So if we're all ready, I'd like to say a couple of things. Just one last thing about housekeeping. please feel free to ask questions. If a question pops up in the chat, we'll try to tackle that issue right there. If not, there'll be a whole section at the end of today's presentation session. We will open it up for questions and so on, so we can go back and review and revisit all of these. So let's start this out in speaking with Carrie. And Carrie, if you could just share some of your experiences. Transformation is a big issue. Lots of key drivers that have pushed credit issues to try to modernize systems. Could you talk about some of these issues and, what are your experiences in leading large-scale transformation initiatives through the process?
Thank you, Ken. I've been at this for over 25 years, both, I would say, not only in the credit union system where I spent previous 10, but also in government, public sector, which is always modernizing or changing, and also with the large banks. And there's a thread through here that I would say, and it's human nature, which is we typically don't want to do it, right? Like I would say that, anyone here that wants to do a core change, I'd love to meet, because typically I find people are like, I'd rather have a root canal. And for good reason. It's extremely complex. It's very risky. And when we talk about transformation, and I like what you said, this isn't like an app where we're going to buy something and go, we're going to use this and off we go, independent of every other process or technology that we have. So when we think about transformations, we tend to think about them in technology, but they're really about business change. When we start thinking about business change, that's when people go, do we need to? Oh, it feels risky. Oh, can we afford it? Because that's when our humanity comes out. And any organization, you're going to have that natural tension that starts at the top. So when we think about strategically, what I've seen is that pressure points typically drive this change. Most cases, it's an end of life notice. And by that point, we probably are reacting rather than actually planning or strategizing. So that kind of puts us on a back foot a lot of times in making choices that we're rushing through, maybe timelines, et cetera. That tends to be, I see, the first big pressure. The other big one is innovation. So we're prevented from doing something really fundamental that we want to do. The problem sometimes with that is we see a thing. And I would say that up until particularly COVID, we had a race for the shiny things. And that's what transformation was going to be about. I'm going to buy the right tool, the right platform, the right thing that's going to make me successful. But the issue is the strategy still needs to be applied. And then the other piece of that is we often make these decisions and contract them without maybe a good appreciation of everything involved, all of the requirements, technical, human, business, which can then really make the whole journey very expensive, frustrating. You get what we call change resistance, which I don't believe in that. I think it's, how we're approaching it, but we'll have that human element of, I don't want to do this. So, other issues come up that also push us there. My system is so old, I'm not meeting my regulatory and compliance objectives. I could be fined if I'm not being able to read this type of data or to take on this kind of new information that is moving forward. I think maintenance alone. And when I talk about that, it's not just about thinking about your computer and, oh, it's getting old, the software and the hardware. Maintenance of the process, maintenance of the people supporting that. Do they have the right skill sets? Are they able to modernize with this? Those are all of the factors, I think, that when you take a step back, modernizing is really about getting to that future state through technology. But so often the tech becomes the migration itself. And then we end up with, I would say, that place where we've got there, but the fulfilled promises didn't materialize. So the ones that are very successful, I think, are able to take, usually it is an end of life notice or some other disruption, but take a step back and then think about all of the components, many of what we're going to talk about today, in that strategic piece before we sit down to start designing architectures and signing contracts.
So it's really funny that you talk about so many times we find ourselves in a situation where it's the technology that's driving us to modernize. Whereas, the real issue is that it should be a business case or a need to grow a business, or like I was saying earlier, finding new customers, opening up new markets that should be driving us forward. So this brings me to the next topic, which is the idea of the business case, the dreaded two words that every technology professional wants to run away from is, how do we as project managers, how do we as adopters of technology build the right business case that allows us to cost justify investments in new technology and how those investments directly relate to growing the business. What are your experiences with some of those topics?
I think that's such an important view. And again, I sort of touched on there's different layers, and particularly for credit unions,
Hmm.
there are different outcomes that you need to meet. So it's not just about profit all the time. There can be community elements, there can be cooperative principles that need to be met. There's uniquenesses, and especially around risk and regulatory, there's a lot of those. So often I do find when people are going in, they're coming in defensively. And sometimes it's almost of a, should we do this? Because that feeling of, oh, it's a lot of work. But the
Hmm.
other part of the ROI, and I think you have to think about this entire thing in terms of returns on investment, not just on what are we going to profit from in the future.
Yeah,
What does that return give us to our cooperative principles? How does it deliver on what we're trying to accomplish as an organization and our purpose?
yeah,
The other is the risk aversion. So it is something I think inherent in credit unions, and it works well in terms of how we think about a community or the impact we can have in that greater, whether it's the environment or it's something that we're trying to address with our business purpose.
yeah,
However, the risk of not taking risks can
mhm,
tsunami all of your efforts. And we often don't measure that. What happens if I take a really safe decision, but I'm out of innovation in a couple of years? We don't always measure those things.
yeah,
What could happen in an unexpected situation? And this actually happened while I was at League Data when we had the pandemic. So guess what? We had a set of assumptions about all kinds of modernization projects and what would happen. And based on our data, and then the data was no longer relevant because
yeah,
now our member patterns started to shift dramatically. And so our risk profile had to shift with it. So I think it's important that you got to kind of step out of yourself. So the organization can become very insular in looking at our own risks and comfort and what we're willing. But you also have to take that step out to say, if we don't do this, what's going to happen to our customer or our member? Where are they going to be? And how do we measure those impacts in addition to just the straight, what if we do this? What if you don't? And that's a question. It's far easier to say no to something than it is sometimes to say yes for the right reason.
absolutely. And so think about it too. The bigger the project, the larger the financial implication of the project, more people have to touch it, more risk mitigation goes into it. And we live in a world where we're always trying to run to stay ahead of obsolescence, right? So the questions are always, if I do this, how long lasting will this investment be? And go
Yep.
back to your ROI points. It's fantastic. So, so can you talk to any examples? Some examples, some project that you were involved in where there was a considered effort to drive modernization. There was a deliberate effort to look to the business to say, if we do this, it'll bring us this result. And what was involved in that kind of a project, if you have an example like that?
Sure, I am going to use the big core bank project because I think we lived through just about everything as we were looking at it. It was a situation, again, we received an end of life notice. In many ways, for me, and again, having 40 at the time, I think it was 42 different institutions that are owners. Guess what, guys? We don't have a choice. We're moving. That in
Mhm,
itself was a bit of a gift, but the challenge is how are we going to bring consensus to
mhm,
everybody and a willingness to move forward? So I could have come in and said, here's what we're going to do, just follow along. Here we are. However, I know from my past experiences what that would do. People wouldn't understand. They would be, wait a minute, you're doing this wrong. We get so far, we would have delays. And with a time challenge that we had, that was one of our big risks. We couldn't afford that. So I think the key is really about lining up the right people to participate as much as they can within the right governance to drive the efforts where they need to be. So one of the things we did in that project is made sure our customer was represented at every single level of the project. At the bottom level, which I think was the key, the most important, we had the folks that were, and actually even some members that were informing the design of the future state. And
Mhm.
a lot of that, I've seen this, it's so easy to go, yeah, we'll gather the requirements and then we'll put it together and we'll do a ta-da. And guess what happens? It's like, well, we couldn't afford that. So by building out those processes and that, what we built was more than just we've got the design right. We built championship. We built people who had their thumbprints as part
Yeah.
of this effort that wanted to see it done. And I think that's all the way through the layers. You need to do that. So that's at that front end. At the middle, do they have the right decision governance and are they able to exercise it and give their feedback? And then as we get to the top, are we holding ourselves accountable for what we said we were going to do? If we have to pivot and make that, are we making sure everybody's coming along with us? At every single one of those human stages is where failure can really take a turn. And it has nothing to do with the tech. The tech can all be moved and changed. It has
Mhm.
everything to do with making sure we're aligning that vision for that future state. So I think the biggest piece of learning, and I continue to learn, is that it will be the human element that will delay or whatever. And if we kick that stuff later and say, I just want to get the work done, you'll either end up with a ton of rework, throw away, or you just won't have the acceptance and the adoption to make it successful. Because getting it done is one thing, but then the second half of that is, can they successfully adopt this technology? And if we haven't prepped the team for how to use it and what they're doing, then guess what? You're going to end up with a situation where a member comes in and you've got frustration and you
Right.
have a bad experience. So
Mhm.
sometimes it's really about taking that and pushing ourselves to be that member at the front going, what's this going to look like? How are we
Mhm.
preparing everybody along? And are we able to make those pivots? Well, you can't do that sitting in a war room with 10 people. You need to make sure you have the right folks at the right decision points. And that in itself is probably 90%, I think, of the hardest work is the human side.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's we'll call it the philosophical aspect of the project, making sure that everybody who's involved in the project has a sense of ownership, right? That they can carry through. It's
Yeah.
fantastic. So thanks, Carrie. Please stay close by. We're going to come back in just a little bit when we get to the panel side of this discussion. I'd like to switch over to Michael, if we could, please. As I mentioned earlier, Michael has a lot of experience, deep experience in a lot of projects, a lot of what we'll call best practices and the associated disciplines, a deep understanding of the pitfalls involved in some of these implementations of new technologies, and to a degree, a lot of what I refer to as a cannibalization of legacy systems in the process. So, Michael, let me start out, if I could, please, asking you what I think is sort of the easiest question, right? And like I know myself, I learn the most from my mistakes, right? So let's talk about some of the reasons that you've seen, not necessarily that you've been involved in, but some of the things that you've seen or that you've come into where a project has kind of gone off the track and you've had to somehow reel it back in and get it back to where it should have been. If you could talk about some of those, it'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, that'd be I can, Ken, and thanks. So I think projects go off track fundamentally for two reasons: the flawed initial planning and the inability to manage scope effectively. And I don't mean just about missing the deadlines that sort of somebody framed up. It's
Mhm.
about building the wrong thing or the organization itself getting paralyzed by the amount of change
Mhm.
that is being introduced and whatnot. So this normally comes through with either underestimation. So the team doesn't understand the true complexity of the legacy environment. A lot of times that's undocumented processes, hidden dependencies, and that effort to do that foundational work, right? The environment setup, the data analysis that's required. The other part of that sometimes is also vendor over reliance. You have a vendor that comes in and says, we've done this before, we understand everything, we're the absolute experts. And you put that blind faith in their out of the box solution capabilities without that deep validation against your specific organizational needs. And what you uncover is their out of the box solution works well for people that exist inside their box. And most organizations weren't built in that vendor's box, so they don't fit in well. And you
Right.
find that out halfway through your program when you're in the midst of that firefight. And then I think the biggest flaw that we've seen countless times, and I'm sure all of us involved in projects, is that change order trap, that lack of robust, reinforced change order control processes, that necessary adjustment. So let me give you a great example of that where I've seen it. I was working for a mid-sized bank. We were replacing their core deposit system. The
Hmm.
initial plan looked solid. The business requirements were high level, but we understood the principles of what we're going through here. About 400 connections to this core banking system that we needed to create and manage. As we were going through this, department after department started raising impact concerns and change requests.
Hmm.
Because all of a sudden, the program hadn't considered things like tax slips, and the tax department hadn't been consulted initially. And all of a sudden, there was a need for tax slips. Small business banking guys said they needed specific reporting. The regulatory and compliance guys came along and said, no, no, no. Not only do we have these regulatory reports that are done on a quarterly basis, we also have these annual reports that also need to be done. Oh, and by the way, we need an internal view and an external view that wasn't planned for. What did this result in? It resulted in over 1,200 change requests, a 40% increase in project spending, and an 18th month delay to the original project baseline. So the best practice I can recommend for anyone here is establishing those really strong cross-governing board from day one for change control and change management, ensuring that the scope of the program is clearly understand, and you're ruthlessly prioritizing those base core objectives of the program for delivery.
Those are exactly the disciplines that keep a project on track and help you avoid that. There's so many hands in the pie. That's a great example of some of them. So as we can all imagine, right, there are often projects where, you know, huge challenges materialize, maybe that weren't anticipated. You and Carrie have both talked about it's all about what you don't know before you
Right.
embark on some of these efforts, right? Uh, Again, you can't have a crystal ball, right? You can't always be ahead and be in the future. But can you give us some examples of, modernization efforts that, because of something popping up, ran into challenges, became a problem, and then how
Yeah,
was it addressed?
sure, for sure. I think one of the great ones is I like to call it the data labyrinth. The
Hmm.
core of any successful implementation is understanding that very powerful asset we have in our organizations, the data, and that complexity involved in understanding, cleansing, transforming, validating, and even migrating that data from the legacy system. It's probably one of the biggest technical pitfalls. And if it doesn't have that clear business understanding, it really becomes garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
the reason for that is that hidden complexity. Sometimes the data structures and legacy systems are poorly documented. I think we've touched on that before, or it
Mhm.
contains embedded business logic that isn't well and clearly defined.
Yeah.
Quality neglect. A lot of us have sort of assumed that data is appropriate and it's flowing into the system, but sometimes it's not there. One of the systems I encountered once, the address information was just incomplete because people didn't see the importance of keeping it up to date, and it just sort of fell into ill repair. Doesn't sound like a big deal, but when you're actually trying to merge multiple sources together and you've picked address as that key identifier for a customer account,
Yeah.
and there's inconsistencies in avenue and road. Do they live on main road or main avenue? These
Mhm.
become real big breakfalls.
Yeah.
And then finally, a migration that just isn't moving. When you have these complex extract, transform, and loads, the ETLs,
Yeah.
that process required for that deep understanding, both source and target systems. If you haven't measured it in a measurable outcome, you can almost come into stagnation, and that can feel overwhelming.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example. I was working on one that was really critical. It was for a wealth firm. They were just migrating their client accounts to a new platform. Fairly straightforward, right? Here's the old system. We're moving it to our new system. Mapping should be great, except there was a flaw. Because of lack of understanding of the data, there was a confusion between the posting date and the settlement date because the two systems had different definitions. and they loaded the data incorrectly. What did this result in? It resulted in a compounding effect because we were recording members' purchases and sales of assets incorrectly with the wrong value dates. So we were associating the wrong values to them. The error wasn't caught until the month end when we actually tried to do the reconciliation, resulting in about 320 million of an out of balance statement and a mad scramble manual effort of reconciling every transactional event for that month, going back and testing in the test system and correcting it. 6 weeks of delays, about 80,000 in just focus spend in the program, and quite frankly, a huge loss of trust because literally we were recalling member statements and saying, by the way, please ignore that. Your trade was incorrectly recorded and we've corrected it. Trust us, you'll see it on your next month's statement. So
Yeah.
those frantic manual efforts can be resolved in that by rigorous data profiling early, having that automation and validation of scripts to make sure the data quality is there, and having that multiple mark migration cycles to ensure that any of these situations are caught early. And then again, finally, rigorous testing to make sure that you're really capturing that well.
That's like a boardroom level event, what you just described there.
Okay, what?
That has an impact on customers all across the spectrum. That's
Oh,
a
yeah.
great one. So, Michael, I know you've been involved in an enormous number of these kinds of projects. So when you think about the aggregate of all of these activities that you've been involved in, let's point to the one or the two top issues that is often underestimated. I mean, you just talked about a range of different topics, but
Yep.
what's one or two keys that are just often underestimated in the array of activities involving these projects?
I'm going to call back to what Carrie mentioned as well on this, and that's the people blind spot, the
Yeah.
change management and training. Oftentimes, we can get really excited about the technology we're bringing in and this new capability that we really neglect that human element, how staff will adopt and adapt to the new system, how it will change their workflow.
Mhm,
And is that, and if that recipe isn't successfully implemented,
mhm.
even though the tech's working perfectly, the program can be a complete failure.
Yeah, yeah.
So a lot of time that's we underinvest in the training. So we provide generic last minute training, right? Here's the webinar. Please sit through 60 minutes of it, and this is going to train you how to do something. It doesn't work through those real world or address the user anxieties about this is what I used to do. Here's what I'm going to.
Yeah. Deep
Ignoring
investments.
workflow designs.
Yeah, yeah.
The other thing here, when you change somebody's workflow, simply overlaying a new system on old processes often fails. Modernization is an ability to improve the new process, requires proactive engagement, sometimes with the users to understand why something's happening and whatnot there. And then Carrie mentioned this, the resistance to change. So failing to communicate the why behind the change involved early creates a resistance and undermines the project goals. I'll give you a great example about this. We had a partner, a credit union, that had implemented a wonderful, sophisticated new loan origination system, completely online, was going to capture loan information and put it on. So the experience was similar to an online online web application, as well as the branch experience for that member experience, or since they're sitting in front of the clients.
Mhm,
Um, and the training was provided by the vendor. It was a generic 1 hour. Here are the things. The screenshots that were provided were generic. They weren't of the particular process. And they didn't address some of the concerns there about the complexities of how to do a farm loan versus a loan for that was securitized against a home equity line of credit or an auto loan. It just was generic loan select dropdown. So the challenge was the staff didn't accept this change really well. They found it confusing and they reverted to manual workarounds. What I meant by that is they started falling back to their Excel spreadsheets and filling things in that way and bypassing things because they know they could then go talk to the underwriter directly and send them an Excel spreadsheet with the information, the decision made. So this wonderful system implemented, very poor
mhm.
take up on it. The
Absolutely.
best practice we saw there was you integrate change management from the start, develop that personal based training, You identify those super users, get their feedback early on, and you have them become your advocates of the system. And then clearly map out those new workflows and show the benefits of it. One of the classic benefits here we did is we eliminated faxing, only to find out that when we were finalizing this, guess what all lawyers still use to this day? Fax. So we had to bring fax back, even though we had this full digital experience. When we actually had to change things out where lawyers were involved for settlement and deals, that we had to be able to fax the entire package to them and then receive the response back from via fax. So we took out this wonderful process thinking it was antiquated and old, which I think we'd all agree a fax is. Except unfortunately, our legal infrastructure absolutely relies on it and rejects secure email or secure document transfers.
It's amazing. Going outside of all the compliance related issues as well, right? Related to
Exactly.
digital, content and so on. That's fantastic. Michael, thank you. Stay close by again, please. We're going to come back. And if we could now transition over to the technical strategies for future proof. Remember, I mentioned the next phase down in our future proofing project stack is to get into the gears. And I'd like to turn it over to Darren. And Darren, thanks for joining today. I think, when you think about it from a technical perspective, right, there's a range of different ways to solve some of these challenges using an array of different, technologies and so on. What have you found are some of the most effective ways to minimize disruption during transformations and modernization efforts?
Yeah, thank you, Ken. Um, yeah, I've seen a lot. I've been doing this for a very long time. I hate to admit how long because it suggests that I may be older than I appear. But close to 4 decades now, I would say, of implementation projects. I've seen a lot. I've seen the evolution of technology since before the internet. Some of the most successful strategies I've seen, first of all, I think I think often jumping on the latest bandwagon is a very expensive exercise. Now that can, set you up for the future and be an investment that puts you in a strong place 4 to 5, 6 years down the road. But just be aware that oftentimes nascent technologies and whatnot, they show a lot of promise. They show a lot of rapid gain at the beginning of a project. But the worst case scenario is finding those technologies can't get you that last 10% of the way there and needing to start over from scratch with a different strategy. So that's something I've always been very, very aware of. And I think especially in banking with credit unions, it's important to choose stable technologies that can get 100% of the way there. That allows you to be able to estimate with reliability when the project is going to be done. Another thing that I think is important is there's a lot of hype around agile development, which I think is fantastic, for a fintech or someone building a new product, and you want to have the dev team experiment and figure out, what's possible, what can be done. In banking, you pretty much know what it is you need to do, and really taking that close look up front of what your end goal is really important. So using a mix of methodologies for your implementation is very valuable. So for example, mixing an iterative waterfall approach that bites off pieces of the project, but allows people to really understand what it is that you're going to build and how it's going to meet regulatory requirements, and really taking a look at your end user perspective. Some of the best projects have been really looking at the member experience when you're talking about credit unions, or the caregiver or patient experience if you're talking about health systems, and understanding what that flow would be like, and then looking at ways to implement that, like rather than as Carrie and Michael were saying, taking a technology bottom-up approach and going with a vendor that they often make promises that's going to work out of the box, and I don't think I've ever seen that be the case. In some cases, you'll see an organization will try to modify their business models to fit into a product, because it's just overwhelming to try and understand how many different pathways have been implemented with whatever technology they were using, and trying to implement that in a new system can be a challenge. There's often a tendency to try and move towards a monolithic system, where, we don't have to worry about integration. Everything's going to work together. It's all part of the same package, but you really just never get best of breed in that case. You can't have better social than Facebook. You can't have better CRM than HubSpot or Salesforce. So integration is a key portion of every strategy. So when we're looking from that perspective, taking a top-down approach to an implementation, trying to achieve an end state, I think some of the most successful approaches have been to look at data-driven approaches. What we'll see with vendor applications, they tend to be hard-coded, as we say, in this box. If you're in the box where the application was built, then there's a chance. But Michael, I think you said, or Carrie, most institutions are not within that box. So now you're having custom code written, which of course is an exercise in introducing bugs, introducing complexity, introducing risk, development, deployment cycles, etc. So some of the most successful projects I've been on back in, even before 2000, we built a system that was data driven. We don't need to be writing code. We want to reflect changes to a data model. And so a business object system we built for, one of the largest payroll providers was based on reading the data model of a database and representing that as business objects that allowed high-level developers to simply, define relationships between objects and properties, methods that were associated with that. And that solution went on for 20 years, where it was still the fastest way for them to support change within the organization. All they had to do was change some structure in their database, and their models would instantly reflect that. I think another really key piece is to separate your implementation from your interfaces into that. So that starts to get into an API first strategy. But it's not just API first. We have to recognize there's a lot of hype around API first, but there are millions, maybe, probably tens or maybe hundreds of millions of different APIs. There is no common API that allows everything to talk to everything else. And when you start to have vendors that have implementation or integration with a third-party product directly, you start to build this spaghetti nightmare of connectivity. I think everyone's seen the network diagrams that result from this, and the fragility that results from that, because the connections between applications tends to expand, nearly exponentially as all of these systems need to share data and to automate flows of functionality across each other. So that becomes really unmanageable. When things break, it's really hard to understand where things break. So what I've seen really successful in that case is having a clear separation between interface and implementation. Once you do that, the implementation becomes a black box. And this is where you can really take a second look at your legacy systems. If you're able to put an interface in front of that is a modern web service interface, it doesn't really matter how that's interacting with the legacy systems. We've had screen scraping systems that you'd have web methods, you would call those web methods. Behind the scenes, it would do screen scraping and enter data into a system that didn't even have integration capabilities. But once you've done that, now that legacy system looks like a modern system, and the priority of replacing that legacy system goes way down because it's actually working. And if you do have the luxury of replacing that system, you can continue to support those existing APIs so you don't impact anything else in the enterprise. And that is really appropriate, I think, especially for banking and for credit unions, because you want to be, disruption is there's a lot of hype around disruption, but the reality is I don't think it's really appropriate for this market. A lot of these big bang implementations and the changes that Carrie's mentioned and Michael have mentioned, they have an impact, potentially for years before you get back to that level of efficiency where customers are happy and they're getting the functionality that they need. And I don't know any organization that can afford to have that kind of disruption in today's market. The best implementations we've had have enabled seamless transitions to new technologies with outages that are minimized, maybe just within seconds, even, because you're able to support the old system and the new system and just find that one switch that does the switch over, and you avoid that impact to the end user.
It's really true. I mean, I think you and I have talked about this many times. So many of these larger projects take on a life of their own, right? And the technology or the application becomes something of a lightning rod for when things go bad, right? So, the topic of disruption is foundational. It's key, right? Can you talk about projects that you've been involved in where you implemented a large system, a core banking system, and had minimal disruption in the organization?
Well, absolutely. So, a core banking conversion itself is difficult to do without disruption. There's a lot of factors that are out of the control of someone who's doing, an integration with different systems or whatnot. There's still a cutover of the data, but some successful strategies have been, for example, building real-time APIs that are going to continue to receive data from systems that are going to remain in the organization. Some, due to mergers and whatnot, credit unions wind up having multiple core banking systems, multiple CRM systems, et cetera. So, being able to have a strategy that allows there to be an interface to what needs to take place that's fed by these multiple systems, and then the systems can switch in the background has been very successful. We had one project, we called it Sleeping Dragon, and it was a massive cutover. Again, we had taken a strategy with a middle tier integration that reflected the APIs of the systems that were in place when we started the project. And then later on, a few years later, we were able to use the same patterns to take out a CRM system and bring in a new CRM system, which was, infinitely more complex. But on that project, I think they had done a really good job of understanding what the end user experience would be. And they had envisioned a lot of functionality that wasn't available from the core banking system. And it would have been prohibitively expensive to have the core banking vendor customize that core banking system to provide that new functionality. So by looking at the top-down designs and what the end user experience would be, we were able to add microservices to enhance existing APIs, to enrich them, to talk to the core banking system, to talk to other systems, to maybe talk to multiple CRM systems to get the full picture on the customer data. And then also having those same connections to the new system and being able to just hit a switch that just did the cut over. And, if it were not for reseeding the IP, the telephony systems, which took, I think, about 30 or 40 seconds, the cutover was instant. And so I don't think a single call was missed. And doing a massive cutover like that after 2 or 3 years of implementation, I think was a real win. Another example, a GL conversion, where we built the real-time interfaces that were going to continue to feed the new GL system from multiple core banking systems, but then just building the real-time integration and then month by month feeding historical data through those real-time interfaces allowed us to encounter every scenario that had happened over the last 2 years. And that provided a high level of quality on the real-time interfaces. So the likelihood of having a post-go live defect was very low. And we got data conversion as a side effect that brought over 2 years of data and matched to the penny in the end. And the implementation was done, I think it was about 6 weeks. And the reality is about 5 weeks of that were design. Another week was actually the implementation. And by having an approach that's data driven rather than an approach that's imperative, code written, code deployed, we were able to adapt to things that were found post go live in a very rapid way without having to rebuild and redeploy the system. We would understand rules that finally came into place, like you say, that were not documented, and just deploy configuration updates, which were much lower risk. And so really, I think the key thing that I would bring to the conversation is having the orchestration between your different systems be from API to API and not from system to system really gives you that flexibility to have an evolutionary uplift, which is low risk, low cost. It's like you're adding this capability to your existing systems, not ripping them out and causing that member impact and that staff impact that can hit you for years. And in the end is probably a compromise just to get the technology working and probably not meeting the end user goals.
Great. So when you think about it, let's go the other way about, the result of some of these things. If you think about the banking industry, one of the most coveted prizes in the banking industry overall is achieving single client view, right? A single depiction of the client and every aspect of your relationship with that client, right? And the products they have, don't have, and et cetera, right? This relies on the topics around data integration, data correlation. Some people use the term data harmonization, and etc. And so that's the technology underneath the business driver, right? Can you talk about an approach to supporting data harmonization efforts as we increasingly try to envelope these, legacy systems and the disparities we live within?
And we're starting
Yeah.
to get questions. I've just noticed one, by the way. So
Oh, great. Shall I answer, or we want to go to the question first?
Go ahead, answer that question, and we'll come right back, because now we're going to go to we'll go to the open question portion of our day.
Sure. So okay. So I'll just address I'll address your question, Ken, first, and then we'll jump to the participants' question, if that's all right. I think what I've seen over the decades is that the number one reason for failures in systems is bad data, and the number one reason for bad data is duplicate data. So identifying, a single record of truth, I think everyone's, heard that phrase and is well aware that that's critical. And I think a lot of strategies like data lakes and data warehouses and what kind of ignore that reality while not giving you access to the real-time data as well. I think it's important that we don't build monolithic systems that take on the job that should be really just allowing the isolation of those systems. I've often thought that a pattern that has a transformation in front of each system, so that system could be changed and the transformation could be adapted to the new system without impacting the rest of the system. And then having that middle tier just do that job of sharing data and transporting data allows you to get access to the real-time data from the record of truth and always have that up-to-date data. The worst case, you might want to have a caching system in case that system is offline, but there are many patterns at the middle tier that can help to ensure that you're actually not duplicating this data, respecting a single record of truth. Such, for example, after a merger, you could be reading from 3 different CRM systems from 3 institutions that have merged and trickle writing it to the one CRM system that's been the chosen output of that system.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm sensitive to the time. We've got about 8 minutes left, but let's go to some of the open questions for the panelists and some of the questions that we've had submitted to us from our audience. So this is the first one. Sune, thank you very much. This is a great question. And the question is for our panel, right? What do you consider to be the best approach to change of the mid-sized financial organizations, institutions' core platform? Gradually phased or the Big Bang approach? Quick pain versus long process subject to organizational fatigue and other considerations. Like, put all those together. That's sort of like the net is Big Bang, slow and methodical. Michael Nolan, what's the right way to sort of tackle these kinds of projects?
Well, I wonder if Carrie and I will have actually 2 different answers given our experience. I believe the incremental change if your organization can allow for it, is the most successful way to make the change. And what I mean by that is the isolation of particular change and you have a very focused business intention of moving that component over. It allows you then to pick best of breed and also to decouple from what is that legacy behemoth that we classically call the core banking system.
Yeah, right.
Carrie, would you contrast that given your experience?
I would, I'm going to add an element though that I've learned from Big Bang, because I had a Big Bang hoisted on us, would not choose it. Though, if you have some backup tooling like a digital twin or something that can help you, you can take advantage of some of the gold that comes from a Big Bang is getting people sharp, getting the reality of time and pressure, and building that sense of we have to do this. We can't kick the can down the road. And I think that can be the challenge of a longer implementation. And I've seen that, as you can get scope creep really easy.
Yep.
Things happen. Well, let's just do, and before you know it, you've run out of money and you haven't gotten to the end state. And especially if you're lax on keeping people along, because you can give the comfort of the transition, but then people can kind of, get a little bit complacent or not, so I would say that definitely an incremental approach that's very well defined, but within that definition, build it like it's a big bang with the right pressures and the right decision velocity. That's the term I like to use. Where a project really starts to fall down is when we can't start making decisions when these pivots and things happen. And that's in a big bang. You end up making more deliberate decisions because you have to. So I would add that component, but absolutely, if you have the means to do it staged and in this way, you're going to reduce a lot more risk. And you probably, if you do it well, will get a very excited crew of people that can help with the later phases as you go.
That's excellent. So another one of our submitted questions. So think about everything we talked about today. Let me contextualize. We've talked about legacy systems and the need to transform those and modernize those. And we were talking a lot about the thing that I think matters most, harmonizing data, integrating data so that we have a single depiction of all of these elements of our client-based projects and so on. Right around the corner, we're soon to be actively embracing things like AI more effectively, more proactively, right? So the big question is, like, how can we talk to an organization's need to balance embracing new tech and driving modernization at the same time, doing that in a way that's in direct alignment with ever evolving regulatory compliance issues, GRC related issues, and et cetera. Can we just talk to that a little bit? And please be sensitive to the time. We've only got like 4 minutes, please.
I'll jump in if you like. I just think that having an intermediary that handles communications between systems gives you a point to be able to have that data available to support those sorts of systems. And so I think that's a valid strategy rather than having every vendor go and implement their own way of feeding that data and having holes in your data.
That's great.
Yeah, go ahead, Carrie.
Probably going to say very similar. But I think, the key is understanding what you're trying to do, what the parameters and the rules are around that data, and then thinking independent of instead of what's possible, getting really down to what's necessary at that stage, and then you can start to design around that.
Yeah. Michael, what are your thoughts?
I was going to echo something very similar to the Carrie, which is that very structured data strategy about what is it that you need to deliver that compliance. And if you keep that always at the forefront of all your teams and minds, then you have that correct approach. So you're not caught off guard, regardless of the change you're implementing.
That methodical approach to everything.
Oh.
So that's great. Well, let me say this, everyone, we've covered an enormous range of topics in an extremely short period of time. We've barely scratched the surface of, the level of detail that we could get into to discuss this more robustly. As the time's, sort of ticking away on us, and we're trying to be sensitive to everybody's afternoon and morning, are there any questions that we can answer for everyone before we run away and conclude the session?
See a lovely comment from Bruce Duthie, just thanking us for sharing our stories. So thank you for staying with us and being here to participate.
Thank you, Bruce. So let me just wrap up by saying, the following. Again, I want to thank our panelists, fantastic resources for everybody. I want to thank all the attendees for, again, taking time out of your day to spend quality time with us. And there's a couple of takeaways that we should consider, right? Think of the depth of knowledge and expertise in this panel here. One of the things that we wanted to offer to everybody, understanding the fact that we really didn't have a lot of time to cover these issues in detail, is a chance to get with you in a one-on-one setting, to understand some of your issues, some of the projects you're working on, and how we may be able to offer some help or advice or et cetera. We'll have a questionnaire that will be available to all of you if you want to take advantage of that. And we'd be happy to follow up with you and, again, put together some quality time in a one-on-one session so we could talk about some of your projects. That's our way of saying thanks to you for spending time with us this afternoon. So you'll be getting emails sent to you. If you want to click on the QR code, there's a questionnaire that's sort of a precursor to that meeting. We'll also make that available to you through the email that we'll be sending out. And generally speaking, we'll be following up and staying in touch with you via email. For those of you who provided us with your email addresses, thank you. We'll also be recording, we've been recording this session. We'll be providing that to you as well. And all of these things come together under the heading of one of the things that we do so well in this group of people here is we offer the ability to do current state assessments. If we can spend quality time with you, understand your intended state, your desired state, the things that are driving your business, both from a business perspective, regulatory perspective, and a technology perspective, we can offer a lot of value to you in helping you perhaps, pick out some points to navigate by on your road ahead. We'd welcome the opportunity to do that. And it's sort of a common service that we offer. So with that, you'll hear more about that via email. Again, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you again to our panel discussions. We look forward to having an additional session like this down the road. Good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.